Breast Cancer Foundation to help save a life. Our qualified personnel will go to your home to pick it up completely free of charge. Donating your old truck or SUV helps pay for the programs available to women affected by breast cancer who need your help. Please help us to help others. Call now.
Good evening and welcome to RFL. I'm Andrew Whitman in for Richard French. President Biden has ordered all flags at public buildings and military bases to be flown at half-mast in remembrance of the 8 victims of the shootings in the Atlanta area spas on Tuesday. The president and Vice President Kamala Harris plan to visit the area tomorrow to support the community. And tonight we're getting new information about the shootings and the suspect. Mourners turning out at vigils overnight to remember the victims of Tuesday's deadly shooting rampage. Authorities say 21-year-old Robert Aaron Long is accused of murdering 8 people in 3 separate shootings at spas across metro Atlanta.
Some guy came in and shoot the gun, so everybody heard the gunshot.
6 of the victims were Asian women. Long, a white man, told investigators he did not have a racial motive, but police said it was too early to exclude that possibility.
We need to make sure if we have any Asian spas, we need to be checking on them.
Officials noted these attacks come amid a wave of anti-Asian crimes.
We are not about to get into victim blaming, victim shaming here.
Authorities say Long had previously been a customer of the businesses.
He apparently has an issue, what he considers a sex addiction.
It was Long's family who helped police after identifying him in these surveillance pictures.
We were contacted by members of the family indicating that maybe their son.
Investigators say they eventually caught up with him south of Atlanta by tracking his cell phone. They believe he was planning to drive south and continue his killing spree in Florida. As you heard in that piece, these murders come as we're seeing a big surge in violence against Asian Americans, even though police say it's too early to determine whether or not this particular shooting spree was a hate crime. It's become so bad that for the first time in 30 years, Congress held a hearing about the issue today. That hearing featured this exchange between a Texas Republican and Congresswoman Grace Meng, the New York Democrat who just introduced a bill to address that rise in violence.
Whether talking about China, the Chi-Coms, the Chinese Communist Party, whatever phrasing we want to use, and if some people are saying, hey, we think those guys are the bad guys, for whatever reason. And let me just say clearly, I do. I think the Chinese Communist Party running the country of China, I think they're the bad guys.
Your president and your party and your colleagues can talk about issues with any other country that you want, but you don't have to do it by putting a bullseye on the back of Asian Americans across this country, on our grandparents, on our kids. This hearing was to address the hurt and pain of our community and to find solutions, and we will not let you take our voice away from us.
On a different front, now that Democrats control both houses of Congress, they're trying to pass gun control bills that have been languishing in Washington for years. The House passed 2 bills last week that would expand background checks to nearly every gun sale in America. But the bill faces a tougher road in the Senate. A senator from our viewing area, Chris Murphy of Connecticut, introduced the Senate version of a universal background check bill earlier this month, and he took to the Senate floor to sell it.
The victims of gun violence are very often put at risk, at harm's way, because there are so many guns that are being sold illegally, or so many guns being sold legally to people who shouldn't have them. We have to recognize that the status quo is not acceptable, and that there is something fundamentally wrong with democracy if a public policy measure can enjoy 90% support amongst the American public, and it can't get passed through the representative bodies that are assembled in the nation's capital.
Senator Murphy is right about the numbers. The latest poll by gun safety groups Everytown and the Gifford Center show that 93% of Americans support background checks for all gun sales. The majority of gun owners and majority of Republicans also support that. Worth noting, this debate comes as we're seeing a huge surge in mass shootings in the country, even though they've gotten very little attention because of the pandemic. Though we've seen a decrease in mass shootings in schools, workplaces, and stores, because those places have largely sat empty. But this chart tells the story. Check out 2020, and you can see how shootings involving 4 or more victims soared throughout last year. To talk about background checks and other matters related to gun policy, we turn now to Shannon Watts. Shannon is the founder of Moms Demand Action, one of the nation's leading gun safety advocacy groups. Shannon, let's begin with the background check bills. A pair of them have passed in the House, the Bipartisan Background Checks Act of 2021 and the Enhanced Background Checks Act of 2021, which would close the so-called Charleston loophole. Both got some but not a lot of support from Republicans. Both, I believe, had some but not a lot of Democrats voting no. Tell us what the bills would do, how they would make Americans safer, and how they might impact the average gun owner.
Well, first of all, it's important to note that this is legislation that is overwhelmingly supported by the American people. About 90% of all Americans support requiring a background check on every gun sale. Where we have seen partisanship around this issue has really been in Congress. You know, we tried to pass this legislation back in 2013, and it failed by just a handful of votes in the Senate. A lot has changed since 2013. You know, back then, about a quarter of all Democrats in Congress had an A rating from the NRA. Today, no Democrats do in Congress. And many other things have changed, like the fact that we now have a grassroots movement that can oppose the gun lobby. So this legislation would make all Americans safer. It essentially just makes bigger this ability to apply background checks, not just to licensed dealers, but to unlicensed dealers as well. It's a system that has worked for licensed gun sales in this country. And so it doesn't impact any law-abiding gun owner. It just keeps guns out of the hands of dangerous people.
You mentioned how popular background checks are in polling. There's far more support among actual gun owners and actual Republicans than there is from their Republican counterparts in the House. Why the difference?
Well, we're talking about a country that has a gun lobby, and it's one of the wealthiest, most powerful special interests that's ever existed in America. And they have held sway with our lawmakers, not just at the federal, but at the state level too, for decades. I started Moms Demand Action the day after the Sandy Hook school shooting tragedy, and in just 8 years, we have become a political powerhouse. And in fact, many lawmakers are much more afraid of angry moms in this country than they are gun lobbyists. And so that has taken several election cycles to change, but slowly but surely we are making progress on that. And we need Congress to reflect the American public, to support common sense gun laws like a background check on every gun sale. Look, we have a 25 times higher gun homicide rate than any other high-income country for a reason, and that's because for far too long, gun lobbyists have been writing our gun laws.
You didn't mention them by name, but it sounds like you were talking about the NRA. They are now in bankruptcy. New York is suing the group because of alleged fraud and abuse and is seeking to have the NRA dissolved. Do they still command the same clout that they've had in the past on these gun debates?
No, the NRA is weaker than they've ever been. The gun safety movement is stronger than it's ever been, and that's largely the NRA's own doing, right? They've been involved in self-dealing and sweetheart deals and mismanaging their nonprofit status. They're under investigation on many fronts. They are now both morally and financially bankrupt, and I think we'll see a lot more in 2021 about the NRA and its misdeeds. But all of that is to say, you know, what used to be a badge of honor, an A rating from the NRA, is now a scarlet letter. And that's why we are working so hard to get lawmakers on the right side of history and to vote with the public and not gun lobbyists.
Beyond background checks, Shannon, what other gun safety bills do you think can become law through this Congress? And I need to ask this question in two different ways. One, if the Senate keeps the 60-vote filibuster, and one, if the Senate eliminates the filibuster.
Well, in addition to the background checks bill, you mentioned that a bill that would close the Charleston loophole passed. That is a loophole that allows licensed gun dealers to sell a gun 3 days after a sale is made, even if a background check hasn't cleared. It's how the Charleston mass shooter got his gun and killed 9 Black parishioners in South Carolina. But there are other things. The Violence Against Women Act, that just passed through the House yesterday with Republican support. It's a bill that's opposed by the NRA because they consider it a poison pill in the bill that would prevent stalkers and dating partners who are convicted of domestic abuse to have easy access to guns. Something called a red flag law could pass potentially. This is a bill that's passed in 19 states, and it allows family and police to get a temporary restraining order to remove the guns of someone who is a danger to themselves or to others. And so again, this is just common sense legislation. You mentioned, the issue of the filibuster. We are having ongoing conversations with Republicans. There was Republican support in 2013. There's even more Republican support now. And sadly, because of the tragedies we're seeing, like what played out in Atlanta with the killing of 8 people during a mass shooting. So, we're confident that there is bipartisan support for this legislation that we're looking at.
Got an unusual question for you related to COVID, because COVID altered American life in so many ways, and it also provided some unique opportunities to study the impacts of people and their behavior. For example, it was one of the cleanest years on record for air pollution because so many fewer people traveled and did their normal behaviors. I thought maybe the same thing might have happened when it came to mass shootings. We certainly didn't hear about a lot of mass shootings in the past year, especially not compared to previous years. Turns out the number of mass shootings actually rose during COVID. It just tended to happen in smaller numbers of victims. More of the shootings happened at home, and they got less media coverage. There were fewer school shootings because there were fewer students in schools for fewer days. I'm wondering if there's a lesson to be learned about human behavior and guns from this COVID year, and whether that may shape our policies going forward.
It's a great point. I think we'll be looking at the data for years and years to come. What we do know is that about 50 million guns were sold in the last year alone. And that's because the gun lobby has stoked fear around the COVID virus, suggesting everyone needed to be armed. And so that's why we've seen that huge increase in gun sales. Simultaneously, we have seen the COVID pandemic exacerbate the gun violence crisis. We're seeing a huge uptick in gun suicides. Gun homicides in city centers are out of control. We're seeing a rise in unintentional shootings, and we expect to see a rise in domestic gun violence as well. And so as we come out of this pandemic, something I'm particularly worried about as kids are going back to school is the fact that all of these new gun sales will sadly equal guns getting into the hands of children. And most school shooters in this country are children who have easy access to guns in their homes. And so we talk a lot about responsible gun storage, keeping guns locked, unloaded, and separate from ammunition. But I really think the reverberations of these new gun sales because of COVID will be with us long after the COVID crisis is solved.
The student movement was essential in the fight for gun safety laws. The Parkland shooting begat the March for Our Lives in Washington and really sort of changed the nature of the debate in a lot of ways. COVID altered the lives of students as much as any other group. It's also altered student involvement, or I'm wondering, has it altered student involvement or student impact in the gun safety movement?
Absolutely. Moms Demand Action now also has a partner called Students Demand Action, and they increased in size exponentially after the Parkland shooting tragedy. And then when COVID hit, what we saw was that so many of these students with extra time on their hands wanted to get involved in electoral politics, wanted to get involved in legislation around gun safety, and did just that. In fact, our Students Demand Action volunteers registered about 100,000 new voters in the run-up to the election, and they have been integral to our rallying around good bills, stopping bad bills during this legislative session. And I think they will be a huge force to come as we work to pass legislation now on a federal level.
Finally, Shannon, we've spent this entire interview focused on the federal level, national policies and issues in Congress. What about on the state level? Any changes or debates of note that would either promote or retard gun safety?
We at a state level, we are trying to end permitless carry proposals in many states, including Iowa right now, which is trying to undo its background check system, which is very concerning. But at the same time, we're finally able to pass good laws in places like Virginia. We were able to flip both chambers of the General Assembly in 2019 in the NRA's backyard. And since then, we've passed close to a dozen good gun safety laws in the state of Virginia and have made a huge change there. So it's always this yin and yang of good bills and bad bills. But the bottom line is we are a force. We are showing up at every single gun bill hearing, and we're showing lawmakers that if they do the wrong thing, we'll have their job.
I hope to revisit this